Imagine, for just a moment, that you are standing in complete darkness.
Just absolute pitch black.
Right, exactly. It is midnight in early March 1918. You're somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and the air is freezing.
That deep, bone-chilling cold.
Yeah, the kind that only exists miles and miles away from any coastline. There are no lights on the horizon. There's no moon. Just absolute pitch black isolation.
It's terrifying to even picture.
It really is. Now, I want you to picture that you're trapped in the belly of a massive 540-foot steel beast. Around you, thousands of tons of metal are just, groaning under the immense pressure of the open sea.
Groaning and shifting.
Right. You are one of over 300 men on board. You're exhausted. You're cold. And then suddenly there is a sound.
A catastrophic sound.
A deafening sound of steel literally tearing itself apart. And after that, nothing.
Just silence.
Nothing but the silent, indifferent abyss of the sea. You just imagine the final moments of the USS Cyclops.
Which is just a chilling thought.
It is. She was a 540-foot leviathan of the United States Navy that just vanished from the face of the earth, taking 306 souls with her.
Without a single trace.
None. No SOS was ever received. Not a single piece of wreckage, not a life jacket, not even a wooden bucket was ever found. Just a complete and total void.
Which defies logic.
It really does. And so our mission for this deep dive is to tear into this real-life maritime horror story. We've got historical sources, declassified military reports, eyewitness accounts, and we're going to figure out how a 19,000-ton vessel simply ceases to exist.
The sheer scale of this disappearance is, it's what makes it so incredibly unsettling. When the Cyclops vanished in March of 1918, it represented the largest non-combat loss of life in the history of the U.S. Navy.
Wow. Still to this day.
That record stands to this day. There's a slight historical caveat that some naval archivists will point out.
Okay, what's that?
Well, there was the USS Insurgent, which was a frigate that vanished in August of 1800 with 340 men during a severe storm.
Oh, right, the Insurgent.
Yeah, but, the Insurgent was a wooden sailing ship from a totally different era. The Cyclops is entirely different. We are talking about modern, industrialized, steel-hulled Navy history.
Right, an era with actual technology.
Exactly, an era of active shipping lanes, established protocols, and wireless communication. A ship of this magnitude doesn't just, slip through the cracks of the ocean.
I want to look at the monstrous scale of this ship, actually, because if you're listening to this and wondering how something so massive just disappears, you really have to understand what it was.
It wasn't a cruise liner.
No, not at all. The USS Cyclops was laid down in 1910 by William Crampton Sons in Philadelphia. The Naval Registry classifies her as a Proteus-class collier.
Which is a very specific type of beast.
Right. Today, we think of aircraft carriers and destroyers when we think of naval power. But in 1910, the global military complex ran entirely on coal.
If you didn't have coal, your dreadnoughts were just floating steel targets.
Exactly. So the Cyclops was essentially a 540-foot floating mechanized coal mine designed to fuel the war machine.
And the engineering required to make that happen was brutal. It was highly industrial. The Cyclops was over 165 meters long and displaced up to 19,360 tons when she was fully loaded.
That is massively heavy.
It is. But what made her visually terrifying and honestly incredibly dangerous to work on were the towering steel rigs on her deck.
Oh man, the cranes.
Yes. She was equipped with these massive clamshell buckets attached to steam-powered winches.
So how did they actually transfer the coal at sea?
Well, she would maneuver alongside a warship in open water, which is perilous enough on its own. And then these mechanical buckets would plunge into her hold, bite out 2 tons of coal at a single time, swing over, and violently dump it onto the decks of the receiving ship.
That sounds like absolute chaos.
It was a sensory nightmare. The noise of the steam engines, the grinding gears, the choking clouds of black soot just filling the air. She was built for heavy, punishing work.
Naming her after the one-eyed giant of Greek mythology feels entirely appropriate. She was an industrial monster.
She really was.
And from 1910 to 1917, she was a highly effective one, too. She was fueling ships in the Baltic Sea, rescuing refugees during the U.S. occupation of Veracruz in Mexico, just keeping the fleet moving.
But then the world changes.
Right. The geopolitical atmosphere violently shifts in April 1917. The United States officially enters World War I, and the moment that happens, the Cyclops is absorbed directly into the Naval Overseas Transportation Service.
And the stakes for every single mariner on that ship fundamentally changed overnight.
How so?
Well, the Naval Overseas Transportation Service, or NOTDES, was the central artery of the war effort. Delivering coal was no longer just a matter of routine logistics. It was literally a matter of national survival.
Because if the ships can't move, everything stops.
Exactly. If the Cyclops fails to deliver its cargo, warships sit idle in port, the Atlantic supply lines are severed by German U-boats, and soldiers die.
So the pressure is just immense.
The psychological pressure placed on the crews of these colliers was crushing. They were sailing unescorted, highly combustible floating bombs through highly contested waters.
Which brings us to a deeply, deeply disturbing variable in this whole equation.
The human element.
Yes. You have a massive, aging ship carrying 12,500 tons of fuel under the paranoid pressure of World War I. But, a ship is only as stable as the person commanding it.
And this commander was far from stable.
I spent a lot of time digging into the naval intelligence records on the captain of the Cyclops, Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley. And honestly, his background reads like Gothic fiction.
He is arguably one of the most abrasive and contradictory figures in naval history.
Yeah.
The Office of Naval Intelligence actually had to thoroughly investigate his past after the disappearance, and the red flags were immediate. First of all, George W. Worley was not his real name.
Right.
He was born Johann Friedrich Wichmann in Hanover, Germany in 1862.
Wait, I have to stop you there. It's 1917. The United States is in a state of total war with the German Empire. Paranoia regarding German saboteurs is at an absolute fever pitch in America. How does a German-born man, operating under a fake name, secure the command of a massive U.S. Navy vessel fueling the war effort?
It's a stunning oversight, honestly. But it was driven entirely by desperation.
They just needed warm bodies.
Pretty much. The U.S. Navy was expanding at an unprecedented, frantic pace. They were requisitioning hundreds of civilian vessels, and they just needed experienced mariners to command them immediately. They didn't have the luxury of thorough background checks in 1917.
So he just slipped through the crack.
He did. Worley had secured a master's ticket in the civilian merchant marine, and that piece of paper was basically enough to get him a commission as a lieutenant commander in the Naval Auxiliary Reserve.
But his path to getting that ticket was incredibly dark, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He entered North America by deserting a ship in San Francisco in 1878, and by 1898, he was running a saloon on the Barbary Coast.
And we really need to clarify what the Barbary Coast was in the 1890s, because it wasn't some quaint tourist destination.
Not at all.
It was an infamous, lawless red light district. It was the absolute epicenter of Shanghai.
Right, where they would literally kidnap sailors.
Yeah, saloon owners would drug sailors, drag them unconscious onto departing ships, and just sell them to desperate sea captains for a bounty. It was an environment defined by violence, extortion, and just survival of the most ruthless.
It was a brutal world to come up in.
So you have a man molded by the criminal underworld of San Francisco's docks, who later captained civilian ships moving questionable cargo, allegedly including opium, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is the guy who is suddenly handed the absolute authority of a military command.
And the collision of that Barbary Coast mentality with strict naval protocol created an atmosphere of absolute terror for his crew.
I can only imagine.
We have this incredible eyewitness testimony from a man named Conrad A. Nervig. Nervig was an officer on the Cyclops who fortuitously transferred off the ship in Rio de Janeiro just before its final voyage.
Talk about a lucky break.
Right. He later published a detailed account in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings, and he painted a picture of a severely deteriorating psychological environment on that ship. He described Worley as an indifferent seaman, a terribly poor navigator, and just a man universally despised by his officers.
Nervig's accounts highlight a level of instability that goes way beyond just, being a strict boss. Worley was described by former civilian crews as possessing a temperament similar to Captain Edward Edwards of the HMS Pandora.
The guy who hunted the Bonnie mutineers.
Yes, the man who locked prisoners in a suffocating box on his deck. Worley was vindictive. He would violently berate his officers in front of the enlisted men, which completely shatters the chain of command.
It ruins any respect they might have had.
Exactly. Nervig even reported an incident where Worley literally chased an ensign around the deck of the ship with a loaded pistol over a minor disagreement.
The psychological toll of that on a crew cannot be overstated. I mean, you are trapped in the middle of the ocean. You cannot escape.
Nowhere to run.
Right. And the man responsible for navigating you through submarine-infested waters is chasing people with a firearm.
It's insane.
And when he wasn't violent, he was exhibiting deeply erratic, eerie behavior. During normal watches, Crew members reported Worley wandering the decks of this massive industrial collier, dressed only in his long underwear, a derby hat, and carrying a cane.
If you're a young sailor sleeping in freezing quarters, hauling heavy lines, and you see your captain pacing the deck at midnight in long johns and a bowler hat, you realize there is no adult in the room.
The person in charge has lost his grip on reality.
Completely. Nervig stated plainly that Worley had created a thoroughly demoralized and disorganized crew. He even blamed Worley's erratic deployment of the men for the gruesome death of a sailor who was struck by a propeller during a botched operation.
Which just adds to the dread.
Right. But the most dangerous habit Worley had, the one that likely doomed the ship, was his paranoia regarding his senior officers.
He routinely confined his most experienced officers to their quarters for perceived slights. He was essentially placing them under shipboard house arrest.
Just locking them away.
Yeah. And to replace them, he forced inexperienced junior enlisted men to take charge of highly complex logistical operations, like, for example, overseeing the loading of cargo.
And cargo loading is not just tossing boxes into a basement.
Hmm?
On a 19,000-ton vessel, improper cargo loading changes the structural physics of the hull. It changes how the ship interacts with waves.
It's a precise science.
Which brings us to the final, fatal mission in early 1918. The Cyclops had successfully delivered nearly 10,000 tons of coal from Virginia down to the South American Patrol Squadron in Rio de Janeiro.
That was the easy part.
Right. But the war effort required raw materials to build munitions. So instead of returning empty, she was ordered to Salvador, Brazil, to load up on a massive shipment of manganese ore.
And manganese is incredibly dense. It's a heavy metallic element that's vital for strengthening steel. The ship was loaded with roughly 11,000 tons of this ore.
11,000 tons.
Yes. And this is where Worley's habit of confining his officers becomes absolutely critical. The crew of the Cyclops were experts at loading coal. Coal is bulky. It fills up the physical volume of the hold long before it maxes out the weight limit.
It takes up a lot of space.
Right. But manganese ore is entirely different.
Let's talk about the physics of that cargo shift, because it's so important. If you fill a cargo hold with coal, it acts almost like gravel. It takes up the whole space, locking itself into place.
It braces itself against the bulkheads.
Exactly. But if you put 11,000 tons of manganese ore into a hold designed for coal, you are hitting the absolute maximum weight limit of the ship, while the hold is still mostly empty in terms of volume.
It's a massive shift in density.
I've heard this compared to packing a moving truck with pillows versus lead blocks, but that doesn't really capture the dynamic danger of being on the ocean. Think of the ship's center of gravity versus its center of buoyancy.
Right, how it sits in the water.
Yeah. If you load dense, heavy ore, incorrectly say, piling it too high in the center of the holds rather than trimming it evenly across the bottom, the ship becomes intensely top-heavy.
And if the ship rolls in a wave,
that massive concentrated weight acts like a pendulum. It wants to keep rolling rather than snapping back upright.
And because Worley had confined his experienced officers, the loading in Salvador was overseen by men who just didn't understand the complex naval architecture required to balance dense ore.
You're basically guessing.
They were. Furthermore, the ship was overloaded. The Cyclops was rated for a standard maximum capacity of about 8,000 tons. Her absolute stress limit overload was 10,800 tons.
And they put in, what, 11,000?
They packed her with 11,000 to 11,800 tons, depending on the reports. They pushed the steel way beyond its engineering parameters before they even untied the mooring lines.
And the mechanical systems were already failing at this point.
Well, it gets worse.
Before departing Brazil on February 26, 1918, a naval survey board confirmed that the starboard engine had a cracked cylinder. It was completely inoperative.
A dead engine.
I want to emphasize the terrifying reality of this for you listening. You have a ship that is massively overloaded, improperly balanced with a cargo the crew doesn't understand, and she's just lost 50% of her propulsion.
The survey board actually recommended she limp back to the United States for repairs.
Attempting to cross the Atlantic Ocean on a single engine in an overloaded ship severely compromises your ability to maintain headway.
It's basically a death sentence in bad weather.
Right. If you encounter a storm, you must have enough power to steer the bow of the ship directly into the oncoming waves. If your single engine isn't strong enough to fight the wind and the current, the ocean is just going to push the ship sideways, parallel to the waves.
Which is called taking waves on the beam.
And it is the fastest way to capsize a vessel. So they depart Brazil and almost immediately realize they are in trouble. On March 3rd, the Cyclops deviates from her route and makes an unscheduled, desperate stop in Barbados.
Because they knew something was wrong.
Observers in the port noted the ship was sitting dangerously low in the water. The hull was submerged well past the plimsoll line.
And for those who don't know, the plimsoll line is a painted marker on the side of a ship that dictates the maximum safe draft. If the water is above that line, you are sinking.
You are overloaded.
Exactly. And while the ship is sitting in the harbor struggling, Captain Worley visits the United States consul in Barbados, a man named Charles Ludlow Livingston.
Okay.
And the communication that Livingston sends back to the State Department following this meeting is honestly one of the most chilling documents in maritime history.
I pulled up the actual text of Livingston's telegram, and I have to read the specifics to you because the sense of dread dripping from this official government document just stopped me in my tracks.
It's so ominous.
Livingston wires Washington and says that Worley came to him demanding money for 600 tons of coal to reach Bermuda, claiming his single working engine was in poor condition.
Which Livingston immediately flags as suspicious.
Right.
Because Livingston discreetly interviews other maritime officials in the port and discovers that the Cyclops already has plenty of coal, likely over 1,500 tons in her bunkers.
Why would he lie about that?
Who knows? But Worley was blatantly lying to a U.S. diplomat to hoard more fuel, despite the ship already sinking below its safe weight limit.
And then Livingston reports on the atmosphere among the crew. He writes, "Master alluded to by others as damned Dutchman, apparently disliked by other officers."
The crew is so terrified and desperate that they are actively complaining about their captain to foreign port officials.
But here is the line that really shifts this from a story about a bad boss to an absolute nightmare. Livingston writes, "Rumored disturbances en route hither, men confined and one executed. Also had some prisoners from the fleet in Brazilian waters, one life sentence."
We really need to analyze the weight of those words. Disturbances is diplomatic language for mutiny.
Right.
He is reporting a near mutiny on a U.S. Navy vessel. Men are locked in the brig. And the rumor of an execution.
Did that actually happen?
The U.S. Navy never officially confirmed Worley executed a sailor on the voyage from Brazil to Barbados. But the fact that the crew believed he did and reported to the consul proves that the ship was operating under a regime of absolute, unhinged terror.
Livingston also notes the passenger manifest in this telegram. He mentions that Alfred Louis Moreau Gottschalk, the U.S. Consul General to Rio de Janeiro, is on board. He notes the 231 enlisted crew.
Yep.
And then, reflecting the wartime paranoia of the era, he specifically points out that many Germanic names appear on the crew list and notes a flurry of telegraphic messages being delivered to Worley in port.
Livingston is a trained observer. He's looking at an overloaded, crippled ship, commanded by a despised, erratic man who was harboring secrets, surrounded by a terrified, potentially mutinous crew, and heavily laden with military prisoners.
And Livingston ends this official telegram to the Secretary of State with a sentence that haunts this entire investigation. He says, "While not having any definite grounds, I fear fate worse than sinking, though possibly based on instinctive dislike felt towards master."
A fate worse than sinking.
It's chilling.
He is documenting his premonition that this ship is a floating powder keg that will not survive the journey.
If you put yourself in the shoes of a young sailor on that ship, the psychological claustrophobia is just suffocating.
It's unbearable.
You're sleeping inches away from an 11,000-ton mountain of rock. The starboard engine is dead. The water line is creeping up the side of the hull. Your captain is pacing the deck in a bowler hat, holding a cane, and might have just executed a man.
And there's nowhere to go.
On March 4th, 1918, the Cyclops slowly steams out of Barbados. The men look back at the lights of the port just fading into the distance.
And that was the last time the USS Cyclops, or any of the 306 souls on board, were ever seen.
We transition now into the void. A day after leaving Barbados, the Cyclops sends a routine wireless transmission.
The final message.
Right. The message simply reads, "Weather fair, all well." It is a mundane message that masks a looming catastrophe.
And after that, there was a brief, really agonizing period of false hope for the families. Rumors started circulating in the press that a molasses tanker, the Amulco, had sighted the Cyclops on March 9th near the Virginia Capes.
But naval investigators quickly debunk this, right?
Absolutely. The timeline makes zero sense.
Yeah, the Cyclops wasn't scheduled to arrive in Baltimore until March 13th. For her to be near Virginia on March 9th, she would have had to travel at a speed mathematically impossible for a ship operating on a single failing engine.
The captain of the Imolco firmly denied the sighting too. It's just a phantom, a trick of the light, or a desperate rumor.
The reality is that the Cyclops vanished. To capture the public shock, I found this quote from a magazine in Santa Fe, New Mexico that wrote, "Usually a wooden bucket or a cork life preserver identified as belonging to a lost ship is picked up after a wreck, but not so with the Cyclops. She just disappeared as though some gigantic monster of the sea had grabbed her, men and all, and sent her into the depths of the ocean."
The technological implication of that silence is profound. By 1918, maritime wireless communication was standard. Ships had dedicated radio rooms. If a vessel is in distress, they send out an SOS.
It's protocol.
Furthermore, a 540-foot ship is a buoyant structure packed with thousands of items that naturally float.
I have to push back heavily on the idea that a ship this size can sink and leave zero trace. I've studied maritime disasters. Even when a massive steel hull goes down violently, something breaks loose.
Always.
Hatch covers splinter. Oil from the bunkers creates massive slicks on the surface. Cork life belts bob up. Deck chairs, canvas bags, and tragically human remains are inevitably found by search parties.
It's just the physics of a sinking.
The fact that literally not a single splinter of the Cyclops was ever recovered means the event was so instantaneous that the physics of buoyancy were overridden by the speed of the descent.
Exactly. And the radio silence also tells us something vital about the timeline of the disaster.
How so?
Well, in 1918, radio rooms used rotary spark gap transmitters. You couldn't just hit a panic button like you can today. A radio operator had to physically start a generator, wait for it to spin up, tune the spark gap, and manually tap out Morse code.
Which takes time.
That process takes minutes. The lack of an SOS means the ship suffered a catastrophic failure that ended its existence in less time than it takes to start a generator.
Wow. The human cost of that sudden silence is just devastating. On April 15th, the missing ship hit the front pages of the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and papers across the country. Families just waited in agony.
For months.
Finally, on June 1st, 1918, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin D. Roosevelt officially declared the Cyclops lost and all hands deceased. 306 families were destroyed.
Just erased.
And among them were diverse stories, like Lewis H. Hardwick, an African-American mess attendant. His loss meant his son, Herbert, grew up fatherless, eventually fighting his way out of poverty to become the Cocoa Kid, a famous welterweight boxing champion in the 1930s. The ripple effects of this single sinking touched thousands of lives.
And because the ocean refused to yield a single piece of wreckage, those families were completely denied closure, which forces us into the darkest part of this deep dive, investigating the theories.
Right, because we need answers.
When there is no physical evidence, human beings will construct narratives to explain the unthinkable. We have to analyze the suspects, starting with the most prominent fear in 1918, an act of war.
The Imperial German Navy's U-boat fleet was the absolute terror of the Atlantic. They destroyed over 5,000 vessels during the war, accounting for 30% of global shipping. It is entirely logical to assume a U-boat put a torpedo into the side of this massive, slow-moving target.
It is logical, but historical intelligence entirely rules it out.
It does.
Yes. German naval commanders kept meticulous, aggressive records of their kills. After the armistice, Allied intelligence seized and scoured the logs of the German Admiralty.
And what did they find?
Nothing. There was absolutely no record of a U-boat operating anywhere near the Cyclops route at that time, and no commander ever claimed to have sunk her. If a U-boat had destroyed a 19,000-ton American collier carrying vital munitions ore, they would have heavily propagandized it.
They would have bragged about it endlessly.
Exactly.
Beyond the paperwork, the physical reality of a torpedo strike eliminates the theory for me. A torpedo detonates against the hull, blowing a massive hole in the ship. The explosion shatters the superstructure, instantly generating a massive debris field of oil, splintered wood, and cargo.
It's a messy way to sink a ship.
The sea would have been littered with evidence. We found nothing. So a U-boat attack is off the table. Which brings us to the paranoid theory fed by Livingston's telegram: mutiny and treason.
Right. The theory posits that Worley, a German-born captain with a fake name, conspired with pro-German sympathizers on board. The passenger, Consul General Gottschalk, was highly unpopular and widely accused of harboring pro-German sentiments himself. So the theory suggests they staged a violent mutiny, overpowered the loyal crew, and sailed the Cyclops and her 11,000 tons of vital manganese ore straight to a German port.
A wartime heist of a colossal scale.
Yes.
But just like the U-boat theory, post-war intelligence thoroughly dismantled this too. If the Cyclops had been handed over to the German Empire, it would have been integrated into their logistics or stripped for parts.
You can't hide a 540-foot ship.
No. Allied forces found zero trace of the ship or the crew in any German port or prison camp. The Cyclops did not cross the Atlantic to Europe.
We also have to evaluate the possibility of an internal explosion.
That makes sense.
The ship was carrying over 1,500 tons of coal in her bunkers. Coal dust is highly combustible, and certain ores can off-gas in a poorly ventilated, sealed cargo hold. A single spark from a dropped tool could ignite a devastating thermobaric explosion inside the ship.
But again, if you think about the physics of an explosion, it doesn't solve the mystery, it actually deepens it. An internal explosion pushes outward.
It blows things apart.
Right. It blows the heavy steel hatch covers off the deck. It blows out the sides of the hull. It violently ejects buoyant material into the ocean. An explosion scatters a ship. It does not swallow it whole. The lack of a debris field forces us to look at natural phenomena.
And the Atlantic Ocean in March is fiercely unpredictable. Meteorological records show that a severe, violent storm swept through the Virginia Capes area on March 10th.
So if they hit that storm...
If the Cyclops encountered this storm, she was in the absolute worst possible mechanical state to survive it.
Because of the cracked cylinder.
Yes.
If a massive storm hits, a ship must keep its bow pointed into the waves to slice through them. But with only one engine, the Cyclops wouldn't have had the propulsion to fight the wind. The storm would have pushed her sideways into the troughs of the waves.
Broadside to the storm.
And if a rogue wave, a massive localized wall of water, slams into the broadside of a ship that is already top-heavy with an imbalanced load of dense manganese ore...
The ship capsizes.
Yeah.
The sheer momentum of that much weight rolling to one side flips the vessel.
But wait, I still have a hard time buying a simple storm capsize. Even when a ship rolls over completely, it takes time to fill with water and sink. Trapped air pockets keep it afloat for minutes, sometimes hours.
Ooh.
During that time, wooden deck chairs, lifeboats strapped to the top deck, and oil from the engine room break loose and float to the surface. How does a storm hide 100% of the evidence?
You're touching on the exact paradox that baffled naval engineers for decades. A simple capsize doesn't explain the absolute void.
So what does?
To understand how a 540-foot ship vanishes in an instant, taking 306 men down before they can even scream, we have to look at the horrifying synthesis of chemistry, physics, and catastrophic structural failure.
Let's construct the anatomy of a sinking, then. We have an overloaded ship, a single engine, and a severe storm. Let's add the chemistry of the cargo. Manganese ore is much denser than coal.
Right.
Even with 11,000 tons maxing out the weight limit, there is physical empty space inside the cavernous cargo holds. And importantly, the hatch covers on the Cyclops were not made of heavy steel.
They were made of thick canvas.
A canvas hatch cover is no match for heavy seas washing over the deck of a ship sitting dangerously low in the water. The storm surge would easily breach the canvas, pouring thousands of gallons of seawater into the holds.
And when that water mixes with the manganese ore, it doesn't just get wet. It turns into a thick, incredibly heavy, shifting slurry.
This introduces a concept in maritime engineering called the free surface effect. Think about trying to carry a wide, shallow baking pan filled to the brim with water.
It's unstable.
Exactly. As long as you walk perfectly straight, it's fine. But if you stumble and the water sloshes to one side, the sudden shift in weight and momentum is so dramatic that it violently pulls your hands with it and the pan flips.
It takes you with it.
When thousands of tons of wet manganese slurry slosh to the starboard side of the Cyclops during a roll, the momentum creates an irreversible fatal list. The ship cannot right itself.
The free surface effect is deadly, but it's the structural weakness of the ship itself that delivers the final blow. This was proposed by Rear Admiral George Van Doors, and it is the most terrifying, plausible explanation we have.
Walk me through it.
The Cyclops relied on massive longitudinal steel I-beams running the entire length of the vessel to maintain her structural rigidity.
Your skeleton, basically.
Right. But these colliers were essentially operating as giant acid baths.
Wait, acid?
Yes, bituminous coal contains high levels of sulfur. When coal dust mixes with seawater in the bilges of a ship, it undergoes a chemical reaction that creates sulfuric acid.
Oh, man.
Navy inspectors had dry docked the USS Jason, a sister ship to the Cyclops, and discovered that this acid had severely, dangerously corroded the central I-beams. The skeleton of the ship was eaten away by rust.
So we have an 11,000-ton block of wet, shifting ore sitting in the belly of a ship with a severely compromised, rusted skeleton.
It's a ticking time bomb.
Now, introduce the physics of a March storm. The waves generated by a severe storm can have a massive wavelength, the distance between the peak of one wave and the peak of the next.
Let's break down the minute-by-minute horror of Admiral Van Door's theory. It's the middle of the night, pitch black. The crew's asleep below decks, exhausted.
The Cyclops is fighting a massive sea state.
Right. She crests a wave, but because of the specific wavelength of the storm, the wave spacing matches the exact length of the ship.
There is a terrifying moment where the bow of the ship is pushed high into the air by the peak of one wave, and the stern of the ship is simultaneously held up by the peak of the wave behind it.
Leaving the middle of the ship, the massive belly holding 11,000 tons of wet manganese suspended over the trough.
There is nothing underneath the heaviest part of the vessel but air and falling water. This is called sagging.
The immense localized gravity of that heavy ore pulls downward with devastating force. The corroded, acid-eaten I-beams groan under a stress they were never engineered to withstand.
And in a fraction of a second, the steel gives way. The 540-foot ship literally snaps in half.
Because of the extreme density of the cargo, the two halves fold inward, plunging downward into the trough like a massive V.
The ship doesn't capsize, it doesn't roll, it breaks its own back and is violently dragged straight down.
Instantly.
The sheer speed of the descent, combined with millions of gallons of water rushing into the massive tear in the hull, creates a powerful downward suction. Any debris, any wooden bucket, any life preserver on the deck is instantly sucked down with the metal.
For the 306 men inside, there is no time to wake up, no time to reach the radio room, no time to launch a lifeboat.
Just the deafening roar of tearing steel, the crushing impact of the ocean, and immediate darkness.
They are pulled miles deep in a matter of seconds. It perfectly explains the lack of an SOS.
Yeah.
It perfectly explains the pristine surface of the ocean days later. It was a sudden, violent, structural annihilation.
If you're listening to this and thinking that sounds almost too catastrophic to be real, you have to look at the deeply unsettling fate of the Cyclops sister ships.
It's a chilling pattern.
The Proteus class had a fatal genetic flaw. The USS Jupiter was converted into an aircraft carrier and survived, but the USS Proteus and the USS Nereus continued as bulk carriers.
In late November 1941, the Proteus vanished without a trace in the Caribbean Sea. Her cargo was a massive load of bauxite, a dense aluminum ore.
And less than a month later, in December 1941, the USS Nereus departed the Virgin Islands and vanished without a trace. Her cargo, also a heavy load of bauxite ore.
Two identical sister ships, carrying identically dense metallic cargo, suffering the exact same silent, catastrophic fate as the Cyclops.
The true monster isn't a U-boat. It's the horrific physics of metal fatigue, shifting cargo, and the crushing power of the sea.
And yet, knowing the physics doesn't ease the psychological trauma of a disappearance this massive, when human logic is confronted with the tragedy that leaves a total void, the mind rebels.
We can't handle it.
The idea that a rusted I-beam in a storm can instantly erase 300 lives is existentially terrifying because it highlights our complete lack of control. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does human culture.
So we filled that void with a myth. We have to talk about the Devil's Triangle, Bermuda Triangle.
It's inevitable.
The Cyclops vanished in a vast expanse of ocean, roughly bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. Today, it's impossible to mention the Cyclops without someone bringing up the triangle.
But it is crucial to ground this in historical reality. The crew of the Cyclops had never heard of the Bermuda Triangle because the concept did not exist in 1918.
It wasn't a thing.
The United States Board on Geographic Names does not recognize it. Major insurance groups like Lloyd's of London do not charge higher premiums to sail through it.
The myth was entirely manufactured decades later. In 1964, a writer named Vincent Gaddis published a sensational article in a pulp magazine called Argosy, coining the term Bermuda Triangle.
He basically invented it for entertainment.
He swept together unassociated tragedies, the USS Insurgent in 1800, the Cyclops in 1918, Flight 19 in 1945, and claimed an anomalous force was swallowing them. The Cyclops became the crown jewel of this supernatural conspiracy.
Soon, authors were making millions peddling theories about UFO abductions, magnetic time portals, and the lost death rays of Atlantis.
But if we analyze the psychology of this, why did the public so eagerly embrace these bizarre theories over the tragic reality of naval architecture?
I think it's a defense mechanism.
Definitely. If you are listening to this, ask yourself, what is scarier? Being abducted by a highly advanced alien race with a purpose, or being swallowed whole by an indifferent ocean simply because a piece of steel got rusty and the wind blew too hard.
Believing in the Bermuda Triangle implies there is a pattern, a monster, a force with intent. It gives us a narrative we can fight against.
The truth that the ocean is wildly unpredictable, infinitely powerful, and completely uncaring is a level of extreme vulnerability that most people just cannot stomach. We would rather blame aliens than accept that our engineering can fail so totally and silently.
That is a profound cultural insight, honestly. We use the supernatural to insulate ourselves from the blind indifference of physics. And because of that, the Cyclops has left a massive, enduring cultural legacy. It became a vessel for our collective anxieties.
Pop culture has endlessly recycled the trauma. Clive Cussler wrote a Dirk Pitt novel specifically about finding the wreck of the Cyclops. In the late 80s, the sci-fi show Quantum Leap featured an episode where the protagonist intercepts the doomed ship.
It's everywhere.
More recently, in the Lovecraftian horror video game The Sinking City, the main character is a survivor of the Cyclops, tying the real-life sinking to the cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft's Dagon. It even showed up in a Scooby-Doo movie about pirates.
That is quite the trajectory.
The story devolves from a front-page national tragedy to a baffling mystery to a pulp conspiracy to a cartoon trope. It is how society digests terror.
But we cannot allow the mythology and the pop culture to obscure the grim reality of what happened to those 306 men. Despite over a century of searching, despite advancements in deep-sea sonar and submersibles, the United States Navy has never closed the book on the USS Cyclops.
The Navy's official statement remains one of the most chillingly brief admissions of defeat in military history. It reads, "The disappearance of this ship has been one of the most baffling mysteries in the annals of the Navy, all attempts to locate her having proved unsuccessful."
When the most powerful naval force on the planet officially calls the disappearance baffling, you know you are staring into a true abyss.
It is a mystery that has stubbornly refused to give up its dead, a stark reminder that human hubris stops at the shoreline.
Absolutely.
The story of the USS Cyclops is a terrifying testament to our extreme vulnerability. We pull iron from the earth. We forge massive 19,000-ton leviathans. We fill them with coal and fire and steam. We draw invisible shipping lanes across maps and convince ourselves we have conquered the seas.
But the ocean always wins.
But the ocean is infinitely larger, infinitely heavier, and infinitely indifferent to our existence. It can shatter our greatest engineering feats in a single second and hide the evidence forever.
It's a sobering thought.
I want to leave you with one final haunting image to carry with you. If Admiral Van Deur's structural failure theory is correct, we have to consider where the ship snapped in half. The route from Barbados to Baltimore took the Cyclops directly over the Puerto Rico Trench.
The deepest part of the Atlantic.
It is the deepest, darkest part of the Atlantic Ocean, plummeting miles below the surface. The water pressure down there is immense enough to crush modern military submarines like aluminum cans. It is a place of absolute, freezing, crushing, eternal darkness.
And that's where they are.
The two massive halves of the USS Cyclops, filled with thousands of tons of rock and 306 souls, plummeted into that trench over a century ago. They are sitting there, right now, perfectly hidden in the pitch black. And when you realize that an entire 540-foot ship can sit undetected in the dark for 100 years, it makes you wonder what else might be down there in the abyss, just waiting to be found.
It is a question that haunts the mind of every mariner who has ever stood a night watch and stared out at the freezing water.
Keep questioning the unknown, look past the myth, look past the official story, and respect the raw power of the world we live in. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the darkness. Stay curious and stay safe.